Welcome to another author biography video. We have got some exciting stuff coming in this one about Ray Bradbury, including how a friend almost ruined his career, the interesting and poetic story of how and where Fahrenheit 451 was written, and the incredibly cute love story between Ray and his wife. I'm excited to get into it with you. Ray is a personal hero of mine, and yes, after all this research, I am gonna call him on a first name basis because I'm gonna say his name a lot in this video, and I just figured, hey, let's make it a first name sort of thing. I like to think you wouldn't mind, and I'm pretty excited to share a little bit of his story with you. Ray's an incredibly interesting man, and I will say that we are incredibly blessed to have access to some of Ray's interviews from when he was later in life. He's an absolutely charming man, and I will be linking a few of those that I could find in the bottom of this video. Before I dive into the fun facts and interesting stories and tidbits and all that good stuff, I do just want to say that my research for this one was not quite as cut and dry as my Louisa May Alcott biography video, so it's not going to be chronological. The biography I read was not the best, so it's a combination of book reading and interviews and just scoping the internet out. So I hope that it all makes sense. I'm gonna do my best. But other than that, let's go ahead and dive into 10 interesting facts you should know about Ray Bradbury. Number 1, Ray Bradbury was the quintessential boy nerd. I want you to imagine a little Ray Bradbury in the best way possible, which in my opinion is little Ray as a nerd. Now, Ray was brought up during the Great Depression. He and his family were very close, likely just because of the great bonds they shared, but also because growing up they would have had to be going through some hard times in a socio-economic sense. To give you an idea of his family dynamic, his mother and father were very hardworking people. Ray got his love of movies from his mother and his love of books from his father. Ray did have an older brother named Skip, who was sort of the athletic kid. So you have Skip, who's Ray's older brother, this athletic child from the early 20s and 30s, and you have this nerdy kid from the early 20s and 30s. I like to imagine their lives on a sort of a parallel, and Ray would later talk about how he and his brother's relationship dynamic flipped as they aged. He's quoted as saying, at some point or another when they were adults, Ray became the older brother and Skip became the younger brother. Instead of Ray going to Skip for advice, it would be the other way around. Ray and his family were very close, and there's no question about that. But you also have to understand that Ray was the nerd in a generation where being a nerd wasn't quite as accepted or encouraged as it is now. So they loved Ray and they thought he was great. They encouraged all of his library meanderings and certainly enjoyed his young, creative mind. But they also didn't quite understand him. Fact number 2, in 11th grade, Ray Bradbury failed his language proficiency exam and had to take remedial classes his senior year. This says a lot about Ray, not only as an adolescent kid, but also as an adult. In high school, Ray was already writing. He wrote often and early, but that's not to say that he was an early genius or that he didn't have to work very hard and sort of self-teach a great deal in order to make his success happen later on. The writing he did do in high school was largely considered full of potential, but quite derivative. If he read something he liked, like he really enjoyed the Tarzan story, for example, it would seem really derivative. It would be really clear that he had gotten the idea from someone else and he was sort of just rewriting someone else's idea. Not a perfect way to get successful in writing at all, but of course we know that Ray would write incredibly individualistic, unique stories from his own mind later in life, and I like to note this because I think it's interesting if you are a writer or you're interested in writing, that everyone starts in a different place. So I just wanted to throw that little tidbit in there. When Ray graduated in, I think it was 1938, he had a little emotional moment to himself because he realized that the entire big world was out there waiting for him. I think this is something we can all relate to because whether or not you go to high school or college, wherever it is that you end that initial journey and go into adulthood, you really have to have like a moment with yourself and realize that it's up to you now. Everything from all of your schooling, you sort of have a path to go on, and as Ray put it, he knew after high school graduation that there was a vast plateau of nothingness waiting for him, and he knew that he had to make it happen for himself, and that's exactly what he did. Fact number 3, Ray did not have a formal education. You might think that for someone who is as celebrated a science fiction, fantasy writer, both of novels and short stories, that Ray would be, I don't know, one of the most educated people on the planet and may hold all these degrees in writing and who knows what else. But the fact of the matter is, Ray was a self-taught student. He could never afford university. Remember, he was a Great Depression era kid. He came from a lower middle class family. Paying for university just was not in the cards for him. So he ended up working for 4 years at a newsstand, and he chose that job after trying out a few others because it gave him some empty time in the morning and the mid-afternoon for writing. That strategy actually worked out pretty well for him, because by the end of the summer, the year he graduated, he would have already completed 15 drafts. That's pretty impressive for a young kid just out of high school. Ray Bradbury is quoted later as saying that he didn't go to university, but instead he went to the library 3 days a week for 10 years. Ray firmly believed in libraries and the power that that free accessibility to knowledge had. And there's a quote from him that I saved because I just love him. I think he's so quotable. But one of them was, "You go into the library and discover yourself." And I think Ray is the living embodiment of that. He believes that there's all sorts of guides and resources in the library that you can really teach yourself anything you want to without having all the expense of a college degree. But if you want something and you go after it and you have drive, like Ray did, then you can really make it happen and teach yourself everything you want to know. Ray knew he wanted to be a writer, so he dedicated himself to that fact. He researched the heck out of writing, and there's actually some really great books that he personally read and was heavily influenced by on the craft of writing. I made note of those as I went through this research because I just thought it was interesting. I don't know, kind of fun. So I am going to compile a list of those, and it'll be on a blog post. And I will link to that when it comes out in the description of this video and maybe share it on the community tab. Probably not for everyone, but I just thought it was an interesting tidbit. If you're ever interested in writing, then that might be a fun resource for you to check out what books Ray Bradbury read when he was developing his writing craft as a younger guy. Ray was heavily influenced by John Steinbeck. That's no secret at all. He was heavily influenced by a great deal of people. Emily Dickinson, Shakespeare, the list goes on and on. Ray was extremely well read, as you can imagine, for someone who spent 3 days a week in the library for 10 years. He really took advantage of learning from other writers and their experiences. He would often study their lives and their writing habits. For example, with John Steinbeck's book, Grapes of Wrath, Ray was really inspired by the way that Steinbeck would bridge chapters and narratives in that book. So he actually took that same concept and used it in one of his most popular books, The Martian Chronicles. Pretty cool little fun fact for you, and Ray never kept that a secret. It's well known that Ray was heavily influenced by tons of other writers. Fact number 4, Ray never drove a car. Ray Bradbury had an aversion to cars. He never had a license. He didn't believe in them as a whole. He was just very much opposed to the idea of everyone driving cars. Perhaps what first nested this paranoia or fear in his mind was actually that Ray witnessed a car crash that killed 6 people. And he was so shaken up after witnessing this horrible accident that he reported walking home and actually clinging to the walls of buildings, holding onto trees, just completely shaken up and horrendously terrified by the event. A car crash is terrifying in any circumstances, but you also have to think about the time in which this would have happened. This is when cars were made out of entirely metal. They didn't have the safety features that we have today. I don't even know if speed limits really existed then. There's a lot of things you have to consider that might have made this an incredibly grotesque experience for Ray, and it stayed with him the rest of his life. He never drove cars and just felt weird about their existence and their accessibility in general. Ray also had some other interesting paranoias or just fears that I think plenty of us have, but Ray just sort of felt fear. He was an artist. You know, he felt these fears in a different way than I'm sure some people do. I mentioned that Ray was the quintessential boy nerd, and that did come with wearing some very thick glasses. This is a fun little interesting tidbit in that Ray's eyesight degraded horribly from age 11 to I think 24. He was absolutely terrified of going blind. That's a terrifying proposition for anyone, but possibly more so for someone like Ray, who was so dedicated in his life to reading books, to writing them, to the art of crafting stories, and I'm sure that it just freaked him out, especially because his eyesight kept degrading and it didn't start off that great to begin with. He actually read a book by Aldous Huxley called The Art of Seeing. In that book, Huxley described a method, I think it's called the Bates method, and you can Google it, but it's basically the idea that glasses should not ever be worn and that they're bad for you, and that you can actually train your eyes like muscles to see different, like, nearsighted, farsighted stuff again. Modern science will tell you that this doesn't work for everyone, but it seems like for some people it has some sort of effect. Ray did try this sort of art of relaxation and retraining his eyes, and while he did not revert his eyes, they never got better after 24, but they also never got worse. So take what you will from that. If you're a history buff, you may be realizing that this timeline is around the start of World War II, or at least the US entrance into World War II. And you might be wondering, did Ray Bradbury serve during this time because he was a young man when the war came around? And the answer to that is no, Ray did not, and the reason was because of his horrible eyesight, which made him unfit for service. Ray also felt a fear that so many of us do, possibly all of us and any of us, which is the fear of death. Man's greatest fear is that he is mortal, and this is something that Ray focused on, and you can see that in his work. Not only the fear of death, but also the opposite of that, which is the embracing of life. And that's sort of a balance that you see. It's a theme that you see in a lot of his works. It's about being a child, about growing up, moving from adolescence to adulthood. Just the passage of time is something that's really profound in Ray Bradbury's works. And that came from this incredible fear of dying. He feared that he would die before he could write his great novel. He feared that he would die before he could contribute anything. And maybe this is part of what motivated him to write so much. Maybe the war going on, maybe just the fear that existed around the world at that point encouraged him to push forward and have more of a drive than maybe some people would. I don't know, just a thought. Fact number 5, and this one makes me very happy, Ray Bradbury met his wife in a bookstore. Let me set the scene for you. It is a beautiful spring day in California, Ray Bradbury's home state, and Ray decides to take a walk, go into a lovely little bookstore, have a peruse around, see what's new, check out the classics. You know how we book nerds do. Ray happened to be wearing this military-esque trench coat with really deep pockets. He had a big satchel with him, and it just so happened that the store he was going into had just experienced a theft. So obviously the person working in the store sees Ray come in with this huge coat that he could easily hide stuff in and this huge satchel, and they decide to walk on up to Ray and sort of strike up conversation. Maybe it was to just say, hey, we have our eye on you. Maybe it was just to try to dispel any chance of a further theft happening, because Ray's outfit certainly was giving the hint that he might have been up to no good. The store was Fowler's bookstore, and the clerk that walked up to him was Marguerite McClure, or as we would come to know her, Maggie. Maggie went up to this stranger thinking that he was going to steal some books, something she was extremely fond of, and they ended up chatting for hours. Chatting turned into cocktails and then dinner, and Maggie and Ray would have a beautiful whirlwind, nerdy romance that warms even my cold, dark heart. While they were talking in the bookstore, Ray quickly appeased her by saying, no, I'm not a thief, I'm a writer, and I'll prove it to you. Do you have a store copy of an anthology? And Maggie produced the anthology requested, and he showed her a story that he had published inside. Now, Maggie was duly impressed, and it went forward from there. Let's talk about Maggie for a second, because I'm basically in love with her. As far as her upbringing was concerned, Maggie was from a slightly higher social class than Ray. Maggie was the daughter of a successful local restaurateur, and she came from a different lifestyle than Ray had, but they bridged that gap again over their incredible love for books. They both loved the greats, they both loved classics, they both read modern works as well, but they loved different categories of the greats. And that was sort of a really wonderful development through their relationship, is because they would be able to talk and discuss books, something they both clearly loved and admired, and it was part of their very being, but they also had just enough new stuff to talk over and cross over and inspire each other with. For instance, Maggie, as a kid, she loved anything with history books. She read so many books on history, and she also had an incredible gift for both reading speed and retention. She also really admired the way books were made. She really paid attention to the craftsmanship, and she would often buy really beautiful editions of books because she just admired the way they were put together, as well as the contents. She was also fluent in several languages throughout her life, so basically Maggie is super impressive, and it's no wonder that Ray fell head over heels in love with her. Ray was 22 when he met Maggie, and she was the only girl that he would ever date. After their first meeting, it was a very quick attachment to one another, and it was clear pretty quickly that they were going to spend the rest of their lives together, which they did. In June of that same year, they celebrated their 1-month anniversary. They went to a beach trip, they went on a merry-go-round at Griffith Park, and they went to see a film together at Lowe's Theater downtown called The Postman Always Rings Twice. On June 20th, Ray bought a book called The Unquiet Grave, and on the end paper, he simply wrote, "Ray and Maggie engaged." Is this not the cutest story you've ever heard about a nerd romance in your life? I love it. They would have over 50 years together, 4 daughters, and thousands of books in their collection between the two of them. They were also quite fond of cats. I think in the 1950s they had over 20 roaming around their house. Also to note, before we hop into the next fact, is that Maggie was the sole breadwinner of the family. Maggie believed in Ray's ability to write and believed in him more than anyone else did. She was the one who went to work every day. She was the one who was the sole breadwinner. She was the one who brought in the money so that she could support Ray's dream of becoming a successful writer. This was in a time when the man not working or not being the breadwinner was not socially acceptable, and I just love to imagine Ray and Maggie, the two of them together, 2 nerds in love, out against the world. I just love that. I think that they are so sweet together, and it was clear that they really cared for each other and that they had just a wonderful, fulfilling life as a couple. Fact number 6, Ray Bradbury's trip to Mexico heavily influenced his work. Ray was not a commercially successful writer for quite a while, but he would make money selling short stories to fanzines and prozines, and that was basically how he earned his coin for quite a long time. Ray was incredibly well researched, and he had a lot of great mentors, other writers, other big names that really helped Ray develop his writing style. Several different people had encouraged Ray to travel. They would say, "Ray, you know the craft, you've researched the heck out of it, but you have to live, man, or you're never going to write anything worthy or anything really truly good." And they encouraged him to travel, to have experiences, to see new places and things. Ray was already heavily influenced and inspired by the neighborhood he lived in. He would travel up and around LA, from Venice Beach to LA, back and forth. He would see a really interesting cross-section of cultures there, really different kinds of people and different types of communities that would really make an imprint on him. But like most people, just need to get out and see the world a little bit, get a different perspective on how different people see the world in more than just one little niche area of the US. Ray got really lucky one year and he sold 3 short stories in pretty short order, and he made around like $970 all at once, which was more money than he had ever seen. Now it just so happened that a close friend of his, this guy named Beach, was going on a trip to Mexico, and he needed someone to accompany him. This Beach guy wanted like an assistant, someone to travel with, you know, someone to like keep each other safe and keep each other grounded and all that. You have to remember that this is traveling to Mexico in the 1940s, which, I mean, I honestly don't even know what that experience was like, but it's always a good idea to travel with someone else and not go into a foreign place completely by yourself. Beach promised a few things in tying in with this like proposition for him to come with him to Mexico. Like he would look over his drafts and that it would just be a good experience for them both. The deal was that Beach would drive the Ford because, again, Ray hated cars and never drove. He hated it. So Beach would be the guy to drive and Ray would be the guy to sort of fill the car up, make sure it was checked out when they stopped at places and things like that. So they sort of worked out their own little agreement for this trip. And we're gonna get into this Beach guy later because I don't know if you can sense it, but I don't trust him. So we're gonna get into that in a second. So they took this old Ford down, crossed the border, went into Mexico, and they went all over the place. It was here that Ray's mind for the first time was saturated with a different culture entirely, and he was absolutely fascinated by it. He saw things that would come up later in his work that you might recognize if you dig hard enough in some of his books. For instance, he saw a woman crossing the street carrying 2 tins of burning charcoal, like fireflies, like 2 burning brains, he said, as she carried them down the walk. That is actually a segment in one of his books, and 10 points to you if you can find it. He also saw a young, dark-haired girl playing a blue piano right next to a window. Just all sorts of things that you would see on your travels that Ray made note of and would impact his fiction and insert themselves into it later. Ray was really impressed by what he felt was the tenacity of the Mexican people. He felt that they lived with death in a very unique way, in a way he hadn't experienced in the US, where life always seemed more tenuous to him in Mexico for whatever reason, yet people sort of stood in the face of that, and I think that really stood out to Ray. He also had some really cool experiences with some of the history of the landscape itself. He traveled to Guadalajara, I think it was. He bought masks from a local craftsman outside of the catacombs there, where these masks, these little miniature wooden masks, would actually become the cover for one of his books later, and if I can find it, I'll pop it up here for you. Those masks are from Ray Bradbury's trip to Mexico, and he hired a photo collage maker to put them together and make this cover. So it's clear that this small trip, which was only about 8 weeks, really stuck in Ray's head. I mentioned catacombs a second ago, and in the catacombs themselves, Ray was completely and utterly terrified. This is another scene that will appear later in one of his works. He was seeing all these dead bodies stacked up together. It really freaked him out, again, coming from Ray, who had witnessed people die, who grew up and was a young man during the war, who would just maybe have different perceptions than you and I might of death. And it absolutely terrified him. He had to be led back out because he completely, what I imagine, he like had a full-on anxiety attack and had to be led back out. But regardless, the story stayed with him, and it did make its way into his fiction later on. Fact number 7, a betrayal from a friend almost ruined his career. We're still going to talk about Mexico for a second, but this leads into the other thing, so just trust me. We're going to talk about this beach guy, and I'm telling you right now, I don't like him. We know that Mexico is an incredible trip for Ray, but I don't want to paint you the wrong picture, because although the experiences themselves and the culture and the place and the people were incredibly influential to Ray, this beach guy, not so much. Beach seemed to be making things harder for Ray than they needed to be. And here's something you have to understand about Beach and Ray together. Beach and Ray, I think it's not clearly outlined in the biography, so I'm inferring here. I think they met through their tenement offices back in Venice Beach or LA. This is sort of a place where it's like a cheap, like a pseudo office. It's like studio offices kind of, so it's not like super secure or whatever. You know, it would have just been like a cheap way to get a business address and have a place to work for a little while that wasn't your home. That's where these two guys connected, so they would have been very aware of each other's careers, who was getting leads and who wasn't getting leads, who was getting more success or otherwise. Now, this isn't something that really concerned Ray, but this beach guy seemed to have this jealousy that he felt that Bradbury's career was getting more traction than his. And that's just a dangerous road for anyone to go down, let's be honest, but this beach guy took it too far. To me, it seems like during this whole Mexico trip, Beach was taking out the fact that he didn't feel as successful, or he felt inferior to Ray's career, or felt like Ray didn't deserve it. Who knows? He was sort of taking things out on Ray and making his life harder. He said he was sick in the beginning of their trip and would get Ray to like get things for him. I don't know if he was actually sick or not, but honestly, I can't confirm that, but I wouldn't put it past this guy to sort of like feign sickness just so that Ray would have to do more. I don't like him. I don't like this guy. You got two guys who are kind of friends, kind of frenemies, stuck in a small Ford car from the late 1930s, early 1940s, just traveling all around Mexico. Now, if you've been on any trips at all, you probably know sometimes trips are good, sometimes trips are bad. Usually, they're a little bit of both. I think this is the perfect example of that. So you got this tension building between these two guys. Ray's a nice guy. He's just kind of doing his best. He's trying to make the most out of the experience. This guy, Beach, would sort of have these moments where his temper would get the best of him and it'd kind of make Ray uncomfortable. And he would also put him in weird situations. Like, Ray didn't speak a word of Spanish, but Beach was fluent. So when they would, like, for instance, come to get the car worked on, Beach would walk away and leave Ray to figure it out. And Ray would be struggling to sort of, like, you know, habla inglés, you know, like trying to figure out what the heck is going on. Just making his life hard, man. Ray had felt a few times like maybe I should just call this quits and go home, but it's not like the trip was that long. It was 8 weeks, significant to today's standards, but not really for back in the day. So he just sort of pushed through. Well, there was one instance where I think Ray was filling up the car with gas and a little bit of gas got on the car. Not a big deal, but this Beach guy just completely freaks out. Like the biggest freak out he's had yet. And Ray is just like, so later on, when this Beach guy is taking a nap, I guess Ray decides this is really awkward and really uncomfortable, and he decided that he was gonna take what he could carry and just go home. The trip was close to the end now, and I think he was just over it. So Ray packed what he could, which was probably his notes and some of his clothes and such, and then he left behind his typewriter, which would have been really heavy, and then some of the purchases he had made, like the masks that would be on his book cover later on, little trinkets and stuff that he had gotten on the trip. He left that all behind because he knew that Beach would take it back in the Ford for him, but he just needed to get out of there. It was just uncomfortable. So he got a bus ticket and he was home in 2 days. He went over to Mrs. Beach's house and said kind of the situation, explained what had happened, because they were friends as well. Like, he was friends with Mrs. Beach as well as Mr. Beach, you know? And I'm sure she knew about his temper and all that. He just sort of waited for this Beach guy to come home. Now Beach, not being the most calm man, decided to stop at a river crossing on the way home from Mexico. He's in the Ford by himself. He's got his stuff, he's got Ray's stuff, he's got all the trinkets from both of them. So what he does is he decides, you know what, screw that Ray guy. I don't like that his career seems better than mine. I don't like that he just left me on this trip. And so Beach took Ray Bradbury's second-hand 1937 typewriter and threw it into a river. Yeah, that's not even as worse as it gets. I wanted to tell you that story first because I feel like it paints you a picture of Beach's character, okay? So now these guys come home. I'm sure it was awkward, but these guys are still friends. And people have tiffs in life and you get over them, right? So that's what I imagine happened. They just went on with their lives. You know, they still would see each other. They weren't enemies. It was just that an awkward little fight had happened, okay? And Ray, pretty forgiving dude, I suppose. And that was just that. I don't know if you're a creative person at all, but you have to understand that, especially when you have a mind like Ray's that was very imaginative and very fluid, when you have something like your typewriter that you put all of your own work into, it comes out of you through this device, which Ray at one point I think compared to a womb. He just really believed in his typewriter being part of the entire like thought, hands, typing story, and that he believed it was an integral part of how a great story got made. So I imagine Ray probably felt really connected to his typewriter, and it was something that he wouldn't have been able to afford easily, because remember, Ray never had money for a long time. So this was something he would have had to save up for and save up for. It was something he bought secondhand. So that's insult to injury enough. You take a guy's typewriter and you throw it into a river. And this was a typewriter that had created hundreds of Ray's early drafts. So rude, you know? Unfortunately though, Beach was not done betraying his friend. So you know these tenement offices where these guys know each other from? I mentioned before, probably not the most secure place in the world. Well, Ray got a huge opportunity in 1946. Martha Foley reached out to Ray at his tenement offices and said, I want to include your short story in my best short story anthology for the year. Big deal. You have to understand that Ray wrote primarily for fanzines and then prozines, and it was a lot of short stories in the beginning and never any novels. So to be recognized in an anthology is a big deal, and as far as his writing career and as far as how that would catapult him into the minds of not only readers but of the publishing industry as far as what Ray was capable of creating. This could be the turning point for Ray's career as a whole. This is something Ray really wanted because he loved writing these fun sci-fi fantasy like short stories, but it was also something that people would give him a hard time about for whatever reason. Like, people have always looked down on genre fiction for whatever, who knows why. And he would like meet people at parties, for example, and they'd be like, oh, what do you do? And he'd be like, I'm a writer. And they'd be like, oh, fantastic, wonderful, very elite. What do you write about? And he would say science fiction and fantasy, and they would be like, you know? So Ray kind of probably felt some bit in him that he had to prove himself. And you remember he had a lot of great writers in his back pocket that he was really inspired by and looked up to, and he wanted to create something worthy of being celebrated. He wanted to create something that would make an imprint. So this was a big stepping stone in that. Unfortunately, this Beach guy had to come in and almost ruin it. Beach, yeah, same guy who threw the typewriter into a river. He intercepted the telegram from Martha Foley and wrote back to her pretending to be Ray and said, yeah, no thanks, not interested. You're lame. I added that last bit, but that's how I imagine it. And Martha gets this telegram back and she's like, huh, that seems weird. I feel like Ray would probably be pretty excited to be in a short story anthology that's of such a high caliber. Seems weird that he would say no so fast. So she just happened to mention it to a mutual acquaintance, like, hey, I asked Ray if he wanted to do this and he said no. I thought that was strange. And this guy was like, huh, that is strange. And he reaches out to Ray, so we have like, you know, a circle here going in the industry of getting back to Ray. And Ray is like, what? He had no idea that it had ever happened because Beach intercepted the messages. It turned out that Beach had been intercepting many more than just the one. This guy had been inserting himself, pretending to be Ray, blocking messages, blocking letters, blocking phone calls, all to the detriment, or trying to be of the detriment, to Ray's career, making things harder. Ray was working on a lot of stuff at the time. This is like when Ray's career started going like, woo, you know? He was working on radio show adaptation deals. He was working on his own short story collection at the time with Derleth. I mean, insane. If this guy Beach had succeeded in ruining all that for Ray, we might never have the incredible books that came later and were so successful and made such an impact, like The Martian Chronicles, Fahrenheit 451, Something Wicked This Way Comes. It's the butterfly effect, okay? Nuts. It's hard for me to believe that people like that exist, but they do. And it's crazy when you read about it, and you read about it from some of your like favorite authors. Like, who does that? Who does that? Beach does, apparently. So Ray confronted Beach and was like, bro, you've been tampering with my stuff? And Beach fully admitted it. He was like, yeah, bro, I have. By the way, I'm adding the bros. I feel like you know that, but just in case, I thought I'd slide that in there to make sure that you knew. So after that, Ray decided tenement offices weren't working so good for him anymore, so he decided to make his professional address his parents' address in Venice Beach, and that was the end of that entire debacle with this other guy who almost ruined Ray's career. Fun little tidbit is that Ray's parents actually lived from, I think, 42 to 47. They lived on the light and power plant, okay? They lived like right there. It was right there. They had a little house right next to, what do you call that? I don't know what you call it. Basically where all of these cool, humming, huge machinery was, that was the view outside of Ray's window. So I just like to imagine Ray Bradbury, a sci-fi fantasy writer who had made a little like office for himself in the corner of his parents' garage on a power plant in Venice Beach, California, typing away at his typewriter and being so inspired by the hum and the incredible machinery and the power of that thing. Fun fact. No? I liked it. Anyway, number 8. Yes. Counting's hard. Anyway, number 8, Fahrenheit 451 was written in the basement of the UCLA library. I'm really hoping that you know what Fahrenheit 451 is because it's one of my favorite things. I've read it 7 times now, and I really think that if you haven't read it, would you please get on it. It's a book about censorship. It's a book about books being burned. It's about a futuristic society where books are literally taken and burned. The title is after the temperature at which paper combusts. Pretty cool, okay? So if you haven't read it, get it together, get on it, and get off of here and don't come back until you've read that. I'm just kidding, but I really think that you should read it. It's one of my favorite classics. As you know, Maggie and Ray would have 4 daughters together, but at the time Fahrenheit was written, he only had 2. And he described them, and this is a direct quote, he described his daughters as loud, wonderful, and lovely. And I just want to say, I love that all 3 of those words are together in one description, and I think that says a lot about Ray and how much he loved kids. So many people would say, my kids are so loud and annoying, but Ray was like, my kids are so loud and wonderful. Like, he loved that they were children, you know? Oh, I just love him. He's amazing. Go watch his interviews after this. I'm gonna link to some. So when Ray wanted to write, he has 2 daughters at home who are really boisterous. He couldn't afford an office. Maggie's at work all day being their breadwinner, so he needed a place to write that wasn't at home. And he discovered, once again, that the library was the solution. Ray was walking around in the library and he heard these mechanical sounds clicking away somewhere. He went down to the basement and he discovered that you could rent a typewriter there for 10 cents for each half hour. Ray looked around and said, yep, this'll do. This is my office. He grabbed a bag of dimes and Ray Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451 in the basement of a library for $9.80. If that's not poetry, I really don't know what is. Fact number 9, Ray Bradbury was asked to change his name for print. Ray Bradbury, you know, these publishers and agents, they said, too boring, too bland. We should make it better. We should make it more exciting. So they tried some things. They tried R.D. Bradbury, Douglas Bradbury, but you know what? Ray decided after a while, and he said back to them, I guess I'm just used to plain old Ray Bradbury. And so gosh darn it, that is the name that we know and we love and we recognize. And more power to him. Number 10, and this is one of my favorite things, Ray Bradbury has a piece of Mars named after him. Yes, I know. I have yet to read The Martian Chronicles, but you should know that a lot of Ray Bradbury's short stories and his books would have influences of space. He's quoted as saying that he once looked up into the night sky, saw Mars, and said, take me home, and he was forever hooked on the idea of space. He was an incredible inspiration in so many kids' minds and so many adults' minds about what space could be. Ray passed away in 2012, and yes, I am very upset that I never had the chance to meet him, but he was honored in a really incredible way. There is a Mars rover called Curiosity. Now, the Curiosity scientific team decided to honor Ray Bradbury August 22nd, 2012, very soon after Ray Bradbury's passing, by naming the landing site Bradbury Landing. There is a piece of Mars named after one of the greatest sci-fi minds of our time. Michael Meyer, who is a NASA scientist for the Curiosity team, is quoted as saying this: "This was not a difficult choice for the science team. Many of us and millions of other readers were inspired in our lives by stories Ray Bradbury wrote to dream of the possibility of Mars." I find this such an incredible way to honor the legacy of a man who left behind not only books, but thinkers. He left behind emotions, he left behind a bit of himself, and that's all any of us can really hope for. Ray Bradbury had some really crazy ideas, or at least was quoted with some fun, unique ideas for how he wanted to be buried. One of those was that he wanted his ashes to be sent up into space in a tomato soup can. But in the end, he decided on something supremely simple. His headstone reads today, Ray Bradbury, 1920 to 2012, author of Fahrenheit 451. If I am ever in California and I'm in that area, you can bet that I will be bringing a bundle of dandelions to Ray Bradbury's grave and paying respects in that way. If you are in California and you can ever make it out that way, I'm a firm practicer of visiting graveyards, and I quite enjoy it. I quite like it. I like to think about the people who were there. And if you ever have the chance to honor Ray in that way, bring him a dandelion. He'd love it. So if you ever get the chance, if I ever get the chance, I hope one of us, whether it's me or you, gets out there to honor him in our own small, nerdy way. I really hope that you have found this biography video insightful in some way, that it helped you feel more connected to this legend of a man that I personally find a true hero to my own intellect and my own mind. He is a huge inspiration for me. I would love it so much if you're on a roll with this. If you're intrigued by him, please watch one of the videos, one of his interviews. I'm gonna link below. You are going to fall in love with him. As an old man, he was the absolute cutest. I wish I had gotten to know him. He has some really cool stories, and he says one sentence and you want to be best friends with the guy. So do check that out if you liked this video. If you like Ray Bradbury, I will link to that below, and also a few other things that I used during the research for this. A few of you have said you like to watch my videos as you get ready in the morning, which is just like the cutest thing ever, and I really like to imagine you doing that. So I'm kind of designing these as something to leave on. That's how I watch videos like this. So I hope it brought you some joy. I hope it brought some interest to your day, and that the next time you see Ray Bradbury on a shelf, you know a little bit more of the story. Next month, I think I'm going to do Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, so we'll see what happens there. Until then, I will see you on my other videos. Thank you so much for watching and for being here. If you're new here and you haven't subscribed, but you like all things bookish, book reviews, hauls, unhauls, DBRs, all the good bookish stuff, then I'm your girl. So go ahead and press that subscribe button, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye, guys.